Anytime? Yeah?
I like the color.
Okay, good to go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on accountability in internet-related policies. Sorry for the confusion for some in regard to the program. Some of you probably saw the old program and came here early. Others of you are looking at the new program and aren't here yet, but we're going to compromise and start in the middle. My name is Jan Scholte. I'm at the University of Gothenburg, and I'm pleased to be able to moderate this session. As said, it's about accountability in internet-related policies, and maybe I should specify our context that we are especially interested in national government accountability in internet governance. So we see increased government and ministerial regulation of internet-related issues in the present time, and all indications are that that regulation by governments will increase. A lot of that government regulation is coming from ministries. And not necessarily through legislative processes of parliaments. So that raises some questions about accountability in the sense that how are these ministerial actions then accountable? All the more because ministries are often working these days in what, if I can show my academic colors for a moment, are often called trans-governmental networks. That means that government ministries are meeting together in venues like the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee at ICANN, or OECD committees, and then interministerially, trans-governmentally, arriving at memoranda of understanding, principles, norms, again, outside the purview of normal democratic processes through parliaments. So we have questions, what does this mean for accountability? And what are governments doing that might be innovative in terms of making themselves accountable to the various stakeholders for national regulation? For that, we have a great panel here from 5 world regions and 5 sectors to give us examples of what has been happening in this area, innovative practices for accountability of governments for their regulation of internet issues. Let me introduce in alphabetical order by their first names. We have Grace Gitaya from Kenya, the Kenya ICT Action Network, co-convener thereof. Thank you very much for coming. We have Leon Sanchez at the end of the table, IP lawyer from Mexico. You might know him as one of the co-chairs of the CCWG accountability in the recent IANA transition. Mark Carvell from the UK government, internet governance senior person there, and working at the Ministry for Culture, Media and Sport. Also the newly elected vice chair of the GAC. Salam Yamut, until 2 weeks ago, national coordinator of ICT strategy in Lebanon, but also on the executive board of RIPE NCC. And Tsuyoshi Kinoshita, who I'm told I'm supposed to call Kino, Vice President of the Internet Association in Japan, with a business perspective. So that's our panel. What we're going to do is take 2 rounds. A first round where the different panelists briefly introduce their context, let you know what's going on. Then I'll go back to you, the audience, for any clarifications that you might want of the initial presentations. And then we'll do a second round of presentations from the panel where they'll reflect a little bit more on what is working and not working in their particular situations. With that, we'll hand over to Mark, perhaps, to give an example from the UK to start. Thank you.
Am I on? Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you, Jan, and great to see so many people here for our session here on accountability. And as Jan described, I lead on internet governance policy for the UK government. I'm in a ministry which is has responsibility for ICT policy generally, including internet policy, and so I'm advisor to our minister dealing with internet policy issues. And first of all, I want to sort of emphasize that UK government policy making has a long tradition of rigorous openness and public consultation before proposed laws and statutory instruments then reach the stage of parliamentary consideration and scrutiny. So it's against that background, a very open democratic tradition in the UK, that I want to speak. But in the age of multi-stakeholder internet governance, clearly we're working in a different way, and we're working in a much more transversal way in terms of engaging with other stakeholders in determining how internet policy globally is going to roll out and develop. It's incumbent on me as a policy official to keep my ministers informed of what's happening, for example, here at the Internet Governance Forum, and also at ICANN on domain names policy, and elsewhere, where discussions are leading to outcomes that reflect inputs from governments in respect of public policy, but also are engaging on an equal basis with other stakeholder inputs from the technical community, private sector, business and civil society, and all the others, the constituencies of stakeholders. So we keep our ministers informed of what's happening in the stakeholder community. And that's very important. Specifically on ICANN and its governmental advisory committee, which I sit on for the UK. Well, the Government Advisory Committee meets every time that ICANN meets in public forum session, but also every 2 years we have a high-level governmental meeting to which ministers and senior policy officials are invited. And bearing in mind the membership of the GAC is now 168 governments and territorial administrations, plus the African Union Commission and the European Commission. It's a very big committee. And when we in the UK hosted the high-level governmental meeting, the second one actually, in London in 2014, we had a lot of ministers there and a lot of senior policy people as well. So there are opportunities for governments at the highest level to engage with multi-stakeholder processes, such as ICANN. The other sort of contextual point I should make is that we have a national IGF, the UK IGF, and that's a platform also for government policymakers to engage with stakeholders. And not only officials, people like me, but also ministers. In fact, at our UK IGF event very recently, last month, we had 2 government ministers there presenting on policy issues relating to their specific dossiers. Firstly, my minister, Matt Hancock, relating to internet policy. He spoke about what's happening at the national level and also internationally, ICANN and our support for the transition, and also the importance of governments being engaged in ICANN policy development and so on. And then secondly, we had our minister responsible for child protection and youth welfare in relation to the internet, Baroness Shields. She spoke at the UK IGF as well. So we have those opportunities to engage with stakeholders from all constituencies through the UK IGF, and the UK IGF also was, had remote participation from across the world. It was quite amazing, actually. We had people joining the discussions from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia Pacific, and Australia. So a very high-profile, multi-stakeholder environment for ministers to speak at. Up until 2013, our specific consultations on internet policy issues were pretty much on an ad hoc basis, driven by whatever critical issue was emerging, be it from ICANN or elsewhere. So, but in the run-up to the 10-year review of the WSIS at the General Assembly, and there was a long process in preparing for that, through the ITU and UNESCO and so on, we took a decision that we wanted to be a bit more systematic about how we undertook those consultations with stakeholders. And so we decided to establish a multi-stakeholder advisory group on internet governance. And it has an acronym, MAGIG, MAGIG, And the original concept for that was to be a what you might describe as a task and finish group connected to the WSIS plus 10 review. We didn't envisage it in 2013 as having a longer life. It would focus on what was happening in the preparations for the WSIS review, and it was the opportunity for us to coordinate with stakeholders in the UK on how we were approaching that UN multilateral process. But it was a very successful exercise in establishing that group, and since then we've decided to maintain it as a permanent forum for us for sharing information, discussing policy, discussing what was coming up, and coordinating UK engagement in international meetings and debates. In fact, we used the MAGIG really to identify non-government stakeholders that we can actually include in our national delegations at ITU conferences and so on. So it's actually a pool of expertise in that group, from business, from the technical community, from the civil society and academics as well. And it has provided a successful sounding board for us to use in terms of allowing us to explain what was happening at the multilateral level, but also to get inputs from stakeholders so that positions that we were proposing to take were properly informed. If necessary, could be corrected, but it was essentially information sharing, telling the community what was happening in the UN, ITU, or wherever, and then getting their feedback on the prospective UK policy. So we've used the MAGIG for big ITU conferences, for the Net Mondial conference in Sao Paulo, for the IGF last year, and for this one, for discussing ICANN, what was happening in the transition process, where governments were, including us, we were actively engaged, and as I say, following on also from the WSIS plus 10 review. So that's the main opportunity for us to identify what stakeholders were signaling as critical issues where they want to put their views forward to us as a government group. But I should emphasize the MAGIG is not a decisional body. It doesn't actually take decisions on what the UK position in these various conferences and events and processes might be. It's ensuring that they are fully informed and that we get their views, and that we can actually have an opportunity to correct anything that we're not getting quite right in preparing for these events, and so on. But ultimately, decisions, of course, will stay with the UK government. But we are confident that that empowers us to be more effective in our negotiations and not to make any blundering mistakes that will rebound on the community. So that's basically our approach to accounting for what we do to the stakeholder community, for getting the inputs from the community through the MAGIG. We also have the national IGF, and then when it comes to specific national policy initiatives, for example on child protection and age verification, there's another sort of separate process for consulting and informing the policy. Okay, I think I've probably gone on for too long, but I hope that's sort of introduced the idea of our advisory group of stakeholders and how it works and its role and functions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Salam, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. Well, I won't be that long because I don't have that many things to say about the Middle East. I'm going to talk about the Middle East, and it's a very varied region. The countries are not similar to each other, but as a whole, we can say that it's a region that is characterized by non-democratically elected governments. So it's either like coup d'etat or kings and that sort. And internet governance, IG, is not a good word in the Middle East. The The governments do not like that word. They don't like the word multi-stakeholder. They tend not to like to come to I'm talking decision makers, to like IGFs and other fora like this. They like to go to the fora where they are invited by their peers. That means another government. So they don't feel the necessity to go and talk to everybody, especially the technical community, about ICT and ICT development. So as a whole, I could say that in general, the decision-making process in the Middle East is top-down, unlike the UK. And unfortunately, top-down does not take advantage of the expertise. So a lot of time, the regulations that come out or the laws are born dead because they're not implementable. Because when the decision maker did the legislation or the regulation, they did not consult with the people who work with this or with the private sector. Now, sometimes the private sector is consulted, but it is not like a systematic methodology like it has to be done. It's more on a per need or per country basis. So there is not such a culture of dialogue before taking the appropriate policy decision. And my observation over the last 6 years working with the government is that the governments in the Middle East are more axed on control and protection as opposed to, say, growth. So when they want to legislate, they think there is a problem that they want to solve, and they will think about it as a control, that why are you doing this? This should be the government doing that. Should be the government doing this. So there is no idea of what should we do to grow the ICT sector or to grow broadband penetration or even to grow the DNS name, et cetera, et cetera. So I find this is very, very difficult to deal with. And I don't know if we talk about the consequences now, but the consequences are it amazes me to listen to Mark just talking before me. The countries that are showing good broadband penetration and good numbers in ICT growth and in ICT innovation are the countries that are actually have built in these mechanisms of consultations within their governments, while I am sad to report to you or to say that in the Middle East region that we don't have such great numbers, but also we do not have these consultation mechanisms built in.
Suggestions of a causal connection.
In the next time.
In the next time, okay. That's great. Kino, tell us a bit about Japan.
Maybe I need to get closer to the microphone. Yeah. So, hi, my name is Kino Shida from Japan. I'm from the business sector, private sector, and I have been involved in various internet-related policy development time to time. From that perspective, I'm very happy to be part of this panel this morning. Anyhow, with respect to the internet-related policy development framework and its accountability from the government in Japan, first of all, we in particular from the private sector are very grateful for the consistent position maintained by the local government that has been unchanged since commercialization of internet. What that means is that while the overall ICT strategy is set under the Information and Communication Council, the position on the internet-related policy is basically appreciating the fundamentals of the internet, that is open and a global platform to drive innovation. Therefore, the government in Japan is more, how can I say, open to consult with the private sector and also various other stakeholders since the beginning. Based on that understanding, in order to drive the philosophy, drive the innovation, the philosophy that the government has been appreciating, it has been expecting the global consistency rather than trying to come up with local or unique practices regard to the internet-related matters. when it becomes absolute necessary, of course, the government has been prepared to provide necessary support locally from the regulatory and policy development standpoint by facilitating a public-private dialogue, which I will share a little bit more shortly after. But normally, the position from the government is to let the collective group of experts concerning with the use of internet to lead the development of the robust internet by collaborating globally. So that is a kind of framework we have in Japan, that it's not a top-down approach, that it's more the open forum, that the government is taking a role to facilitate the multi-stakeholder based consensus building before develops any policy recommendations. So let me spend a little bit more time on the more specific about the element of the framework I just talked about, what we have in Japan with regard to development of the internet-related policy. First, the government normally install the public-private consultation committee or study group by inviting the subject matter expert or the expert who bring the skills and the knowledge required to discuss and review the recommendation for the policy development. That the committee or study group normally comprise of 20 people coming from the academia and the technical committee and the businesses and also users and of course government officials. And depending on the significance of matter that is going to be discussed, we do actually see not only the government officials from the ministry, but also the members of the Diet as well. So that membership is actually depending on the types of the matters we are actually dealing at the committee or study. And second, when the committee or study group come out with recommendations for the regulatory or policy matters, the government in Japan normally actually do the outreach, meaning that inviting a broader audience to review and provide the feedbacks on the recommended proposal on the policy, new policy to be adopted. So that actually takes place before any decisions gets actually made. And so that point of view, we have very open forum from the Japanese government with regard to the internet-related policy development processes. The recent examples which gone through that kind of processes include the guideline and the action plan for the promoting IPv6 adoption, and also the reviewing resiliency and the transparency of the national top-level domain name management. The other examples are the location-based service application in conjunction with the privacy law, because everybody is actually seeing new business opportunities by utilizing location-based information for the various the customer experience driven the new services. And then lastly, we do also see that a similar process has gone through on the holistic cybersecurity law, which was adopted last year in Japan. So let me stop here, but those are the kind of the high-level flavor of what kind of framework we have in Japan.
Great, thank you, Kino. We'll come back for more detail in the second round. Grace?
When it comes to ICT policy making process in Kenya, there has been a history of consultation of the different stakeholders to contribute into different proposals of law. However, in 2010, we got a new constitution, which now places a requirement on anyone making public policy to consult those that are affected. The ICT policy making is conducted by the Ministry of ICT, which has an advisory arm called the National Communication Secretariat. and also through the sector regulator, that is the Communications Authority of Kenya. So the process is such that an initial or a draft law is developed and then shared with various stakeholders, drawn from businesses, from the civil society, from the technical community, from academia, and others. Then, once they contribute, these contributions are consolidated, and the regulator is in charge of calling for face-to-face meeting to discuss the proposals before the next step. Usually, we've had the process has been that the regulator publishes the community's input into its website, and therefore stakeholders are able to see if their contributions were taken on board. However, as is expected of such processes, many views are sometimes not even considered, leave alone adopted. And yet, no reasons, or even, we don't even say compelling reasons, but there are no reasons provided for the rejection of the different submissions. And so the process has its own challenges. For example, even as the Constitution has that requirement of public participation in policy making, we still have no set standards for public participation. And therefore, many institutions are still struggling on how to ensure public participation, not only public participation, but how to make public participation meaningful. Therefore, there is actually a need to have a public participation framework that provides clarity on why submissions are, say, not reflected in the final outcomes, and just provide reasons that then stakeholders would accept that actually their submissions either offended the law or offended morality, or just something that is not acceptable within the law. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Grace. Leon, initial reflections on what you're hearing?
Well, thank you very much. My name is Leon Sanchez. Well, I hear that we have, of course, different approaches to the multi-stakeholder way of building regulations and consulting with the incumbent parties, and how these different approaches, of course, have some impact on what is done in regard to the internet. But I'd like to tell you a little bit of how things are done in ICANN and how we designed a framework for accountability in this process related to the IANA stewardship transition. So within ICANN, we have a policy development process in which the different supporting organizations begin discussing an issue, and if it gets enough traction, then the policy development process actually begins formally, and we provide input from the different stakeholders and the different constituencies that form ICANN. We open each of the documents for public comment. We usually hold public comment periods for 40 days, if I'm not mistaken. I'm looking at Grace. Yeah, that's right. And well, after these public comment periods, of course, the feedback is gathered, then the input is received and incorporated into the documents, and afterwards, then the community posts this policy for approval by the board. So before we had the transition, literally the board was the most powerful figure within ICANN. So as the transition needed to take place, ICANN coordinated this effort with the different communities, and while the initial proposal for transition was being designed, then a group of people within ICANN realized that if we weren't going to have the backstop of the US government anymore, then we needed to enhance ICANN's accountability, right, and transparency. So for this second group, which was the cross-community working group on enhancing ICANN's accountability, which I co-chaired with Thomas Rickett and Matthew Bale, were in charge of designing this proposal on enhancing ICANN's accountability. So if you look at this, this was a way to achieve a form in which the ICANN board and the ICANN an ICANN as organization would be accountable to the different bodies that actually form the organization. So for this, we designed a structure that was based on building blocks, as we call them, throughout the process. And we looked at ICANN as in a similar way in which we could think of a state or a nation, right? So we had our constitution, which were the bylaws, our executive power, which would be the board, our people, which would be the constituencies, and our judiciary, which would be the IRP process. So with these 4 building blocks in mind, then we began a process of identifying which were the accountability measures that were already in place and where did these measures needed to be actually updated, enhanced, or reviewed, or maybe there were more measures that needed to be put in place and designed so that we could achieve this balance between the community and the board as the directing body within ICANN. So throughout the many efforts that and the tireless hours that many volunteers worked in this process, we came up with a report with some recommendations in which I think there are two main proposals or 2 main mechanisms to hold the organization and the board accountable. The first one being the empowered community, which is now in charge of exercising certain powers that, as I said, the intent of this empowered community and the powers that it has been given is to try to find a balance between what the board can actually decide and do with whatever is done within ICANN and their policy processes, and what the community might see or perceive as an appropriate action from the board in said cases. So to give you an example, some of the powers that have been invested into this empowered community have to do with budget approval, with bylaws approval. We designed 2 new set of bylaws, the regular bylaws or ordinary bylaws, and the super bylaws, as someone might call them, the fundamental bylaws, right? So the difference between regular bylaws and fundamental bylaws is the threshold that of approval that the community needs to actually support in order for these changes to take place. So what happened before we designed these accountability measures and these accountability mechanisms was that if there were going to be any bylaw changes, the board would build, of course, a project. It would go to public comment. It would gather the feedback from the different stakeholders, and it could or it could not incorporate the feedback received, and then afterwards they would approve any bylaw changes. Now that has changed. The empowered community has the ability to first reject any changes to the regular bylaws, and secondly, to approve. It actually needs a positive action from the empowered community to get approval on any changes to the fundamental bylaws in this new structure. So, as I said, these are some of the powers. We also have some new mechanisms to remove directors from the board. We can have the whole board removed, or we can have certain specific members of the board removed. So these new powers, as I said, are trying to bring this balance into the interaction between the community and the board of directors. And the other essential change in this transition is the new IRP process, which also is said to be the jewel of the crown of all this accountability process. And it has, of course, been reviewed and has been thought of as a more robust process in which the community could react to any kind of decisions that the board, actions or inactions that the board may take in appropriate way, as some of the stakeholders could say, or could have some kind of harm or detriment by this action or inaction. So this is in a picture, bird's eye view, what we did in the accountability, the cross-community working group on enhancing ICANN's accountability, and we're now continuing to flesh out certain topics that were reserved for a second phase of our work, which is commonly known as Workstream 2 for those who are involved with the work of this cross-community working group. And these topics include some issues that have to do, for example, with building a framework of interpretation for human rights, with enhancing the diversity requirements for the ICANN community, with transparency, with how do we achieve that SOs and ACs are accountable as well? What do we understand as accountability in the context of SOs and ACs? Staff accountability, also the role of the ombudsman in these new bylaws and in this new organization. And this will continue to, of course, evolve and provide this new set of accountability measures that hopefully in the end will serve the purpose of actually bringing that balance and having an accountable organization to its community. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you very much, Leon. So this was an initial survey of different practices that we see around the world. Remember, our question was, how are governments, as they make regulations about internet-related issues, how are they being accountable to those who are affected by those regulations? And we've heard different things about more formally institutionalized mechanism in the UK, expert consultations, more ad hoc perhaps in Japan. Top-down lack of dialogue, I guess, is the picture that Salam gave us in the Middle East. Consultations on draft laws in Kenya. And then as a contrasting experience in the private global governance of ICANN, a whole array of new accountability mechanisms that have been created there. So you've got a lot to sort of reflect on. Are there any questions from the audience in terms of clarification of some of these issues? I see three. If we could take those three, and then maybe we'll come back to the panel. So I see you, there was one, and then, can you show the hands again? There were three of you. We'll start there. And then there was one in the middle and one there. Okay, Malcolm? Sure, go ahead. Please let us know who you are if you can.
Hello? Yeah, now it works. Hi. Good morning. Igor Ostrowski. I'm the outgoing chairman of the Polish Digitization Council, which is probably something close to what the UK has done. We are a multi-stakeholder group, 20 people appointed to advise the government, 4 from each stakeholder group. And after 3 years of experience working within the structure, I feel accountability is absolutely key. And I was wondering whether you see any opportunity to move the model that ICANN has created, and I'd love to hear more about the report, by the way, on accountability, into those governmental structures, like the UK Advisory Council or the Polish Council. Because what we faced at the end, I can say that after 3 years in, is that if the government is not accountable, at the end of the day, we become a social club. And there's 5 stakeholders that meet, and happy to provide advice to the government. But if the government doesn't listen or doesn't care to listen, then either we meet without a purpose, or even worse, we become a vehicle for different types of lobbying efforts, so that you end up having people who are there only to get their particular interests across to the government, And that's very dangerous because I believe that kills the multi-stakeholder model. So if we care for the multi-stakeholder model, we need to think about getting the government on board. And I was wondering whether you have any ideas how to get that done. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Just for the clarification, it didn't come up on the notes. Your example was from Poland, yes?
Yes, correct.
Thank you very
much. The
much.
Polish Digitization Council.
Great, thank you. There was one in the back, yeah? Go ahead. Is there a second mic in the back? Otherwise, go ahead, Malcolm.
Someone looking for it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Know. Do you want me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I was very struck the difference between the contrast between the first two speakers on the situation in the UK, situation in the Middle East, couldn't have been more stark. Not just in terms of the practice, but in terms of the outcome. Mr. Carvell was saying that he felt that as a result of their engagement, they felt not only did they have adopt policies that had the confidence of the broader community in the UK, but they were able to draw on expertise, even to the extent of bringing in multi-stakeholder experts into intergovernmental discussions on their behalf. Whereas by contrast, I think, Salam, you described the situation of policies in the Middle East being stillborn because they were simply unimplementable because of the refusal to engage. My concern is, in your person, if you don't mind me putting it that way, we have a government person that is practicing openness to multi-stakeholder consultation, willing to come here and talk about it, but from the Middle East, what we actually have is a representative from the technical community expressing frustration. We don't have the governments, they don't, as you said, did not feel the need to come here. So maybe they're not going to learn from this opportunity to learn from these experiences. How do we get past that? I would like to particularly put that to Grace, actually, because what we heard there was less of the extremes there, but more a report from a country that still has some challenges in the degree of consultation, but certainly, to my mind, it sounded like it was moving in the right direction. In particular, you said that the Constitution had been changed and adopted this principle that there must be consultation. And so even if that isn't fully developed yet or it's a work in progress, that sounds like movement in the right direction, that maybe the situation for the Middle East, we might hope to get there. So I'd ask particularly Grace, how did Kenya move to start to believe that this sort of thing was important, and to get started on that path?
Okay, thanks. I initially saw a third hand. Did it go down? Up here in the front. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Keisuke Kamimura. I teach at a university in Japan. I think I have a question for all of you. I see most of the panel focused on a sort of institutional design in making internet-related policy accountable, such as multi-stakeholder-based consultation in advance. But I think to make internet-related policy accountable, you can also give some kind of fact-based justification or review after making the policy and putting the policy in place. So what do you think about this?
Okay, good. So accountability not being just about consultation, but also ex-post evaluation of what happens. I understand you. Yes, good. Okay, let's go back to the panel. May I also abuse the chair and ask you a question too? Apart from Kino's one reference to the diet, no one talked about Parliament. And traditionally, if we think about a government's accountability, it's to the elected representatives of the people in a parliament. So is it the case then when we move to internet-related governance, parliaments don't count, and they're not part of the accountability equation? I tease you with that. Okay. Should we go down? Kino, you want to
There are
start?
3 questions. And
Yeah.
I could...
Answer the one you want.
Take whatever you like.
So let me address the last question, which is kind of easier for me to answer. Once again, that based upon our practices we have in Japan, the accountability is not just to get the expert consulted during the course of the policy development. In Japan, the Japanese government has been adapting the four-stage management method, so-called PDCA. So plan, do, and check, and act. So meaning that once the policy gets adopted and implemented, there is a mechanism actually being used in Japan to measure whether or not the expected effect of a policy is actually there or not as an outcome. And if not, then the periodical basis, based upon, once again, the PDCA cycle, there is actually a mechanism to adjust or correct the course of actions after the policy gets implemented. So that's kind of the practices we have out of Japan.
How did Kenya come to start believing in multi-stakeholderism? I think I will say that it's the context that became a challenge. In 2005, different people were reviewing different legislations that pertained to their sector. And one of that was broadcasting legislation. And broadcasters sat together, drawn from different broadcasting sections, the public, community, and commercial. And once they were, they had finalized on their draft, it emerged that there were issues of convergence that could not be dealt alone by the broadcasting sector. And so the process was stopped. And at that point, it was agreed that there needed to be an ICT policy that then would inform any other law that would come in the broader ICT realm. Pardon? Oh, okay. And then and so in 2006, stakeholders came together, different stakeholders, because the movement on new technologies had begun. There had been processes, and Kenya had been following the World Summit on Information Society. So there were all those new things that had come up, and it was agreed that they would have to be incorporated in order for them to make sense. And so in 2006, different stakeholders drawn from new technologies and the broadcasting sector and the information sector came together now and collaboratively developed the ICT policy of 2006. And I think that is where multi-stakeholderism began, and actually that is when the Kenya ICT Action Network was born, because it was the platform that then was used to bring people together and to work with the government. So everybody who thought was a stakeholder worked very well. But again, in terms of the government, there was a very progressive minister who actually agreed that these issues were complex and needed a multi-sectoral approach. And so that is how it started. And from then on, any law that has come has had to engage different stakeholders, even before 2010, when now this requirement was put in the Constitution. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go into the solutions from now. So, how do we make governments who do not believe in the multi-stakeholder system or approach change their mind? So, the first one is to have somebody enlightened or to have a need to do that. For example, in Lebanon, what has worked is like they had this law by the not the government, by the parliament, about the e-transactions law, right? So that's a framework law for doing e-signature and all of this. It stayed 5 years in negotiations, and then was blocked at the end of the whole circuit by the private sector because it contained some things that were unacceptable to the private sector. The private sector did lobbying and stopped it. So what happened is the prime minister, then an enlightened person, progressive, then decided to convene a committee where they put inside the committee members of the private sector, two from professional associations, as well as the other ministries. So this is something that worked. That works and that anybody can do. So we can start thinking like this. The other way we can do is learn from bottom-up processes that work. For example, at the RIPE NCC and the technical communities, policies are made. I mean, they're discussed on the mailing list. People raise their hand and they talk about them. Then people meet face to face, and the policy is discussed again. And at the end, it's a bottom-up. There's some kind of loose consensus. We are far away from reaching this in the government frame of mind. But what we can do, what we have been doing at the RIPE NCC, is to foster the dialogue between the state and non-state actors. So we have these called roundtable discussions where we start talking to the governments about how their legislation could become better, how their policy will be better if they sit down and they talk to people who have experience in this domain. And as newly appointed head of the regional bureau in the Middle East, I intend to also do the same thing, is foster the dialogue with governments from the ISOC also point of view. So this, I think, talking to the governments is going to help solve the problem.
Okay, thanks for the questions and comments. Excellent points have been made. If I just pick up firstly on review of process, of policy delivery, review of outcome of negotiations, it's a very important exercise to undertake, and it should be a very inclusive exercise. The MAGIG, our advisory group, the MAGIG, is the opportunity for us in government to feed back to the stakeholders. This is what went well, for example, at the recent World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly, WTSA, where we had succeeded in advancing UK positions, and where we had defeated proposals that were red lines for us, that we would not support. And there were a number, I won't go into detail about WTSA, but those who are familiar with that will know that there were some crucial proposals there that had to be challenged. And at the sort of political level, in respect of policy, there are rigorous processes of scrutiny through the parliamentary processes, through the parliamentary committees, the all-party committees in the Parliament, to scrutinise what the government has done, the positions it's taken, how its laws and statutory instruments have performed, with a view to identifying what could possibly be reconsidered or corrected. And then, speaking of parliamentary engagement, Jan's point, I'm afraid I'm going to give you another acronym just to add to all the ones that overwhelm us in the sphere of internet governance. The acronym is PICTFOR, P-I-C-T-F-O-R. It stands, and I had to check it because it's quite a long acronym, Parliamentary Internet Communications and Technology Forum. Now, this is a rebranding, if you like, of a previous designation, which was the Parliamentary IT Committee, another acronym, PITCOM, but it's now PICTFOR. And this is an all-party grouping of parliamentarians in the House of Commons and the House of Lords in London. But also you've got business representation on it, academia, academics are there involved, and technical people. So it's the opportunity for across Parliament, those parliamentarians who are really tracking what's happening to the ICT sector, to broadband rollout, to domain names evolution, and so on, to discuss those issues and bring us, ministers and officials, into those discussions. And there was indeed a picked for conference, a Parliament and IT conference, I think it was back in October, just across the road from the Houses of Parliament, where the agenda engaged on all those issues. So we have a lot of parliamentary engagement, and we've brought parliamentarians to the IGF in the past. We haven't any this year, I have to say, but in the past we've brought individual parliamentarians from the UK Parliament to the Internet Governance Forum. And there are members of the European Parliament here, actually, including one UK member of the European Parliament who's here in Guadalajara. So there's a lot of parliamentary engagement, and that's a very important part of the engagement and development of policy and accountability for those policies. Thank you.
Thank you. So, answering or trying to answer the question from the gentleman from Poland, I'd like to draw a line or a difference between the ICANN accountability model and the ICANN bottom-up, consensus-driven, multi-stakeholder policy development process. And if you ask me, how can we port the ICANN accountability model to the governments? Well, I wouldn't know how to do that because, of course, governments, as my teammates here have said, are already accountable to their electorate, and they have different accountability measures to the parliament and to the institutions and to the people that elect those governments. So I don't think that's something we could just port from the private sector to the governmental sector. But if we refer or we think of the decision-making process, the policy development process, that's another story. And I think that there is a chance for us to port this model into governmental related decisions. And let me give you an example of what we're doing in Mexico. In Mexico, if we have internet-related policies that may affect, of course, some of the ecosystem or some of the stakeholders, what we do is that we discuss widely with the government, and the government has been open enough to realize that the participation from the different stakeholders in relation to internet-related policies is important. So what we did is that we formed a group, which is the Internet Governance Initiative group, that is formed by the different stakeholders from private sector, of course, academia, civil society, governments, and so on and so forth. And we hold regular meetings in different venues within Mexico, and we discuss any topic that we think or that any of the stakeholders raises as being important to the group. And we also have as an objective to build capacities and create awareness on internet governance. And one of the outputs from or the products from this group is that we also hold an annual event on internet governance in Mexico. So you could say it's a local IGF, but it isn't really, because it's not even branded as such. But the effort is to, as I said, first create awareness, then on a second level to create capacity so that the civil society and the different stakeholders understand how this multi-stakeholder model works. And lastly, but not least, to create this awareness in the government. And I think that one of the most difficult parts in trying to port this model to the governmental policy development process is to achieve the government realizing that the role here is to facilitate and not coordinate, right? So when you have the government being a facilitator and not a coordinator, then this whole process shifts to the grassroots and to the horizontal community that the multi-stakeholder model fosters. So that will be an answer to your question. I hope that's useful for you. And as for the question from the gentleman from Japan, I think that yes, a constant review is needed, both before and ex ante and ex post of the development, the policy development process. So I think that if you have this kind of organization or inertia with between the government and the different stakeholders, then it'll come natural to continue to do these consultations beforehand and afterwards when a policy is in place. So yes, I definitely agree that the effort should be continuous and not only something that needs to be done previous to affecting any of the policies that are internet related. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We had this confusion with the schedule at the beginning, and we've been given permission by the organizers here to carry on a little bit beyond 11:45. So we can take some more questions if you'd like to raise those. Governments are accountable, no problem. I would have two questions for the panel myself then to think. One is that people are saying, Leon, you said governments are elected. Governments are elected, but officials are not. And a lot of the times these are official regulators who have not been elected. So it's not always necessarily that clear that they're accountable in the way that parliamentarians are. And some of these mechanisms that you were describing are sort of being put in place so that those official regulators are accountable as well. So is this enough? And second, other related question, accountability is about consultation, it's about evaluation, it's also about transparency. And how much, when you are describing these different mechanisms in Japan, in Kenya, in the Middle East, in the UK, in Mexico, how transparent are these processes? The colleague from Poland was raising the issue, how do these consultation groups not become vehicles for lobbying and special interests? So maybe if we could finish with those questions, unless there are other questions that would like to come from the floor. Okay.
I think in terms of accountability, evaluation, and transparency, I did raise that that is actually one of the challenges because, yes, groups will make submissions, and then their submissions will be missing in the final outcome. And so people have been asking, why is it that our submissions never reach that standard, that it could reach that final outcome document? And I think that is still a challenge. And that's why for Kenya we are saying we would like a framework, a public participation framework that outlines the processes and even reporting back, so that it's stipulated clearly that either your submission was nonsense or it has no relation, whatsoever with what was required. I guess so that is something that we will still continue to be agitated for, and people to continue making those proposals and ensuring, and just discussing again in a multi-stakeholder way of how that can be achieved. The second thing about, there was the questions about government accountability. And I have heard that, we've even had that argument internally. You go to this and there's a committee saying they have been appointed by the government. And they claim that the government are elected by the people, and therefore they have the mandate to represent the people. So sometimes it's not even necessary to have that multi-stakeholder approach because that government has been elected by the people to represent by the people, which I don't necessarily agree. The second argument that is put forward is that governments give legitimacy to processes, that they also provide the environment for all of us to do what it is that we do, including policy making in ICT processes. And therefore, I think we have not been able to come up with hard and fast responses to some of those challenges. And I can only say that we still have many rivers to cross when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, so just one comment from me. In terms of the government's accountability challenges with regard to the internet policy development, and as the internet-related policy matters gets complex and also touches on the variety aspect of the real world, we do see the inter-ministerial coordination is actually creating the challenge to make accountable, to make the government accountable, because so far the internet-related policy matters were handled by the certain ministry, but now we do clearly see that inter-ministerial coordination is necessary in order to make accountable policy decisions going forward. So that area we do see as a kind of areas for the improvement going forward.
Yes, I want to touch on the legitimacy concept that Larry Strickling talked about in his opening remarks at this IGF. So we have to start thinking about, what gives you the right? Because it's a government, it has a right to be correct all the time, or it has a right to do this and that. And when people take their time and resources and money to meet several times and to come together to a consensus, that's not respectful, that's not taken seriously. So we need to start thinking about what is legitimate here and which is not. And for your second point, transparency, absolutely, transparency. And it is, we have to learn to be transparent. Being transparent is a lot of work. You have to document what you're saying, you have to publish it, and maybe that's the shining light that is going to make rulers behave differently when they know that they are watched, that somebody knows what they're doing and can then elect them or not elect them in the next election.
Thanks. Just a couple of comments from me in respect of my role as a career civil servant and official, reaching out to stakeholder communities and engaging in many key processes that will impact on the evolution of the internet, including IANA stewardship transition from my seat, the UK seat in the Governmental Advisory Committee. The committee itself has to reach consensus decisions, and that involves sometimes quite challenging negotiating situations. So how am I accountable for that? Well, I'm accountable primarily to my minister, who then in turn is accountable. The minister is a member of the government, elected government, of course, and then accountable to Parliament, and so that is a kind of chain of accountability, if you like, primarily. Of course, in the UK, we also have the Freedom of Information Act, which enabled anybody to access official documents. So any of the reports I do, any of the recommendations I make to ministers on what positions I should take in ICANN or elsewhere, or ITU, or whatever, all of that is freely available for anybody to access as the right of a citizen to access that information in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. So there are those important mechanisms. On transparency, yes, in the MAGIG, I think we have a bit of work to do, to be frank, to enhance our transparency. We are obviously, in our working as a group, We're about 30 members, government, private sector, technical, academics, civil society people, we're about 30 in the group. And everybody sees documents and everybody has the right to say their piece and the right to go against majority views. So there's absolute transparency about how those discussions develop in the group, which then inform us in government on our policy, as I described earlier. So there's that. But in terms of wider public access to all the information, to our deliberations as that group, we do need to do a bit more in order to maximize that. And we will do that. We've been reviewing the MAGIG recently, its membership and so on, ensuring we've got the right people, that the people who are in the group are fully committed. We've got a process of evolution. The group hasn't been active that long. Was it 3 years? And transparency is a very important aspect, and we're looking at that now. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So you mentioned legitimacy, you mentioned transparency, you mentioned elected governments. And, well, of course, some governments are elected, some others are not, some others are legitimately elected, you may say, some others may not be that way. But I think that what's important in this context is to realize, or at least I believe, that we're living in times in which we might be seeing the birth of a new kind of democracy, right? Because on internet-related issues, at least, I believe that the legitimacy of any policy will be given not because those who are participating in shaping those policies are elected or anything like that. I believe that the legitimacy will come from having all the interested parties contributing to that effort and being, as you said, transparent about it. That will be the factor that will bring legitimacy to any internet-related policy. So I guess this might or might not evolve to a new way of governmental policy making process, but I'm sure that for the years to come, the multi-stakeholder model and the exercise that has been evolving through these last years will gain legitimacy, as I said, by having a wide participation and exemplary transparency in the way that things are done. That will support the decisions itself. So you can think of maybe free trade agreements and how they are negotiated by the different parties today. And if we add to that model of negotiation the participation of the different stakeholders that will be affected by those free trade agreements, then another story in negotiation will come in the years to come. Thank you.
Okay, we're getting close to finish. Any last comments from the floor? All set? Okay, I think then we'll wind this up. We've been looking at a key question of accountability in internet governance, this time focusing on the governments and the ministries and the regulators at national level. Of course, there are many other accountability issues to address as well. We looked at the ICANN case as a comparison, and there are many other places to go also. The accountability show will run and run, that's for sure. But I want to thank very much the panelists who've come together. I should say they've not worked and spoken together before. This is the wonderful thing about the IGF. You can bring people from all these different regions, all these different sectors together, and they immediately have a conversation that goes very deep. So I want to thank all of you very much for having come together. I also want to thank Izumi Okutani, who's been quietly sitting here, but she actually drew us all together. So thank you very much, Izumi. And thank you for being here.
Enjoy the information.
Thank you very much.
It's inspiring.
That was lovely.
Jumping in without